And you think, okay. Um, and actually, a lot of people say literature is either about sex or death. So we get half of the equation here. So we're going to start off by Laura Friedman, who is my student. And she's going to be talking about Pride and Prejudice and Master of None.
Hi. Oh, I don't know how to work this, but so as Dr. Morgan said, I'm Laura, and I'm a junior at Flinders Prep, and like she also said, I wrote about Pride and Prejudice and the Netflix original Master of None. Oh, whoops. Well, I had slides, but that's okay. So, women's narratives often conclude the work with the protagonist's death or marriage, a tragic ending, or a happy ending. This historical conformity leaves modern-day readers studying works such as Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, questioning whether the characters' happy endings with a diamond ring on their fingers and a man's arm around their waist is truly what they desire. By contrast, the Netflix original, Master of None, although containing romance, undermines the conventional marriage plot seen in Pride and Prejudice by focusing the main characters' trajectories not at their romantic lives, but more at their individual happiness with their own identities. From the first chapter, Jane Austen subtly criticizes marriage as a social institution instead of a union of lovers. In the most ironic lines of English literature, the narrator opens a novel about marriage with the comment that, quote, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife," end quote. As much as we readers tell ourselves that Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy's marriage is truly founded in love for one another, Austen's biting remarks reflect the wider social politics of the time period. All women must get married. It was the most important decision a woman could make, and throughout Pride and Prejudice, seemed to be the solution to every problem. When Lydia Bennet ran away with Mr. Wickham and tarnished her virtue, what saved Lydia from a scandalous reputation and humiliation of her family? Marriage. After remaining unmarried for years, what spared Charlotte Lucas from becoming a disgraceful spinster at the cost of living a boring and mediocre life? Marriage. Due to the lack of a son, what saved the Bennet family from the loss of their home? Marriage. Even the heroine of the story, Elizabeth, whose initial refusals to marry Mr. Collins and Mr. Darcy at the expense that she would save her family's estate, which demonstrates her unique and progressive personality, gets married in the end. Although our hearts swoon for Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, the portrayal of a woman's role as only a wife is not an accurate expression of their honest emotions, but more as a depiction of deeply rooted social conventions. By contrast, the characters in Master of None are less occupied searching for a mate than they are searching for themselves. The series mainly centers around Dev Shaw navigating through struggles in his professional and personal life. Its plot, however, is not just a televised narrative about Dev, but spans its focus to bigger ideas and characters. In both seasons, viewers got insightful episodes, such as the Parents episode, which demonstrated the sacrifices immigrant families made for their children through a series of flashbacks of Dev and his friend Brian Chang's parents. Indians on TV, an episode which brought to light the racist portrayal of Indian Americans in modern television through Dev and his friend Ravi's audition experiences. At the episode Ladies and Gentlemen, which conveyed the sexist differences in the treatment of men and women today. Religion, an episode which highlighted the diverse religions around the world and Dev and his cousins' struggle to express their own beliefs to their parents. The critically acclaimed Thanksgiving episode that dealt with Dev's friend Denise's experience over the years with her family's acceptance of her sexual orientation. These individual episodes give the overall series so much variety and richness because they deviate from Dev's viewpoint and eliminate the supporting character storylines to the major character storylines, or the plot points. Yet even the romantic plots in Master of None are not all projected towards the eventual fate of marriage. Dev's first real relationship with Rachel Silva is not about their union's gradual evolution to their future marriage, but more about their understanding about each other. Instead of encountering roadblocks like normal couples do, such as how many kids they want, or where they want to live together, they deal with Dev's Indian parents not accepting his white girlfriend and Rachel's doubts about her career and ultimate professional aspirations. When the topic of marriage even comes up, Rachel decides to end it with Dev to pursue her dream of going to Tokyo, stating, quote, "I love you, but I want to do this. This is important to me. I don't want to wake up one day and wonder what would it have been like to live in Japan," end quote, prompting Dev to pursue his passions for pasta by going to culinary school in Italy. If either of these characters had lived in the same era as Pride and Prejudice, both would have been shamed or been outcasts of society for not getting married, which illustrates the gradual dilation in social rights for both women and people of diverse ethnicities. Moreover, the romantic perspectives in Master of None are not strictly heterosexual, but also incorporate homosexuals. Dev's friend of many years, Denise, has many obstacles hindering her from achieving her happy ending that do not just include her search for the right companion, such as her family's acceptance. Over the span of many years in the Thanksgiving episode, viewers see Denise's realization of her attraction to women, her coming out to Dev, and eventually her own mother, and the girlfriends Denise brings to a few Thanksgivings, instead of the traditional storyline of a straight woman anxiously waiting for her Prince Charming to sweep her off her feet. If anything, the dynamic of this episode is between Denise and her mother. When Denise comes out to her mother as a lesbian, her mother is shocked, stating, quote, "I don't want life to be hard for you. It's hard enough being a black woman in this world, and now you want to go and add something else to that," end quote. In the awkward Thanksgiving meals that follow, the focus remains on Denise and her mother's complicated relationship and its years of unease, confusion, and mother-daughter love, instead of Denise's romantic relationships. The episode ends with Denise's mother finally saying to Denise, quote, "I'm happy for you," end quote, symbolizing her mother finally getting over her homophobia to accept and love her daughter for who she is rather than who she dates. Unlike Pride and Prejudice, Master of None's use of multiple perspectives does not depict these episodes with a larger narrative endgame in mind. Instead, it challenges social norms of the time period, such as marriage, relationships between the race, and heterosexuality by portraying layered and conflicted characters without the tunneled vision towards the ultimate fate of marrying someone. It also leaves readers of Pride and Prejudice, besides wishing that Elizabeth lived in the progressive 21st century, questioning the legitimate motives governing the female characters to get married, as not truly for love, but rather to conform to society's conventionality of married life. Master of None's undermining of the traditional fate of female characters being marriage is a message to women and men of all sexualities and backgrounds that you have to love yourself before you love someone else. Thank you.
Right, and now please welcome Sophia Sears from Crossroads.
How do I use this? Just press the arrow.
The right hand.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'll be discussing a personal essay I wrote entitled A Difficult Girl. So I'm going to talk about that title a little bit. So I chose this title because a difficult girl is what I've been called throughout my 18 years of life. Different variations of that: moody, bossy, angry, queer, bitchy, feminist, killjoy, feminazi, etc. Different variations, all quite creative. And it took me a while to start to question those words and to pick apart at the seams of those easy descriptors that were thrown around to describe me. Because to label me a difficult girl was to simplify something that I knew to be all too complex, girlhood. To call me difficult was to dismiss girlhood as something not meriting exploration or nuance, and the fluidity and contradictions of multitudes of being an adolescent are not often afforded to teenage girls. And the literature that we read in school, unfortunately, seemed to reflect this. Until last year, when my 11th grade English class was centered around American literature, and although we read the quintessential kind of American coming-of-age story like Gatsby and such, we also departed from that narrative and took an untraditional approach. We read a book by James Baldwin called Giovanni's Room. Usually when you think of the American Bildungsroman or the coming-of-age story, there's kind of this homogenous sense of what that is. So there's the white, male, heterosexual narrative, hypermasculine, and we usually take that as representative of all of America, all of our stories and all of our experiences of growing up, even though America is something vastly more complicated and complex than that. So Giovanni's Room is, to put it very simply, is about a 20-something-year-old white man, American man named David from somewhere in the Midwest. And so the identity of the narrator is pretty unremarkable for a coming-of-age novel, but the location, the setting of the book is what is really interesting because it takes place in Paris, and this is in an American literature class, so I was a little confused. So the reason why is because David is an American in exile. And this is a self-imposed exile. He theoretically conforms to American standards of manhood. But his is a tender and very fragile masculinity that's easily torn apart because David is queer. His queerness is nuanced and complicated, and he has a sexual fluidity that complicates his ability to conform to the standards of a good American male. And here is where it starts to get discomforting. In James Baldwin's world, the American in exile is a very interesting role because David, throughout the entire novel, is kind of teeming, like pungent and sticky with shame. Everything about him is just embedded with shame. And that could easily be an association between being queer and living in shame. But instead, Baldwin kind of twists that narrative and changes it into being American as being living with shame. So he makes shame synonymous with Americanism. Giovanni, the man, he's an Italian bartender that David falls in love with when he's in Paris, is not from America, and he's utterly shameless about his sexuality. He's entirely open about his queerness, whereas David envies and resents this and is totally unable to be the same. And while I was reading this, I saw something of myself reflected in David that made me a little bit uncomfortable. I was still in the United States. I wasn't in Paris, but I felt like an internal American in exile because of my own queerness. Shame was something that was embedded into my experience as a teenage girl in America. And everything I knew about myself and couldn't admit was ripe with shame. My wanting to love in a way seemingly radically different from how I was supposed to, and my rejection of being this holy embodiment of femininity felt almost unpatriotic. So I, in myself, felt like an American in exile. And it's something, obviously, that James Baldwin knows a little bit about. So there's this line that Giovanni says to David, and he says, "You want to be clean. You think you came here covered with soap, and you think you will go out covered with soap, and you do not want to stink, not even for 5 minutes." Because David rejects this stink that is the human condition that often our coming-of-age stories reject in favor of something much cleaner. But in fact, in my experience, queerness and growing up is a lot more complicated and messier and quote-unquote unclean than what we'd like to believe. And so the setting is incredibly important. That's Paris in the 1950s, because being an American in exile, although it's taken very literally here, is not something that is not so rare as it seems. So the next aspect of this coming-of-age story is sexuality as self. So this cover has kind of this sensuality about it, and that sensuality simmers throughout the entire novel. Giovanni is totally unafraid to lay himself bare. And keep in mind, he's not from America, which is a very deliberate choice. He's unafraid of totally uninhibited intimacy, of rawness, both physical and emotional. And David is the total opposite. And while I was reading this, I was reckoning with my own fear of intimacy and my own queerness and how those two things were just kind of inextricably intertwined. To understand David, I started to understand myself. My discomfort wasn't really about my sexuality. I felt that my lopsided sexuality reflected something more lopsided about me as a person. So what Baldwin does that is so genius is that he uses sexuality as an allegory for the self. It's more of a vehicle to explore the intricacies and fluidity of being a person rather than just being a queer person. So he kind of universalizes that experience, and you don't have to be queer to feel like you're undefinable and fluid and always evolving. If you recognize that, it's from Call Me By Your Name. So what Giovanni's Dream did for me is that it explored intimacy, and it used intimacy and sexuality as a vehicle for understanding growth and coming of age in America. And I believe that intimacy is often necessary to understanding our own experiences as young people in all its dark edge, often very grotesque and very uncomfortable and beautiful parts. And sex and intimacy are differentiated in Giovanni's room. And the line drawn between the two is a line that kind of unsettles David throughout his entire American existence. To engage in sex with Giovanni unnerves him because sex transcends physical pleasure and it becomes intimacy. And he's afraid of that. And I understand that feeling. As he said, there's a line that he says, thinking on this subject, he says, even at my most candid, even when I tried hardest to give myself to him, as he gave himself to me, I was holding something back. Because intimacy is to disrobe oneself of one's mythologies about oneself. It's to stop telling yourself lies, and part of that is disrobing yourself of the lies that your country has told you. And David is, by the end of the novel, honestly unable to do that. But the novel was what kind of cracked me open and made me understand that that was something that me as a queer person needed to do. And so why I chose to talk about Call Me By Your Name is because a new American Bildungsroman or coming-of-age story is emerging, and it has been for some time, and Giovanni's Room struck that chord open for me. Call Me By Your Name is another coming-of-age story set in Italy about the American in exile, about men who fall in love with each other. But also, as I said, it reflects American life more so than most books I've read that are actually set here. And we need this kind of coming-of-age literature that embodies and explores the nuances of selfhood and to use sexuality as a vehicle to understand the fluidity, messiness, and undefinability of ourselves rather than force us into binaries, because it gives us something universal and it gives us stories to work with rather than assuming that every single story is linear, straight, and binary. And this is a story about learning yourself through somebody else, as is Giovanni's Room. And so I think that this is ushering in kind of a different era of a coming-of-age story and what it means to be a person. And so back to being a difficult girl, we need stories about difficult girls and we need stories about difficult people, because nuance is often lost in this country, and the nuances and multitudes and contradictions that we hold as young people need to be reflected in the literature that we read in school as well. So that is my spiel.
Right, and now we're Aaron Solomon from Milken, and I think in some ways his talk will interact with the first two presentations. So please welcome him.
All right, hi. I have a slightly more lighthearted approach to bisexuality because that's how I like to do things. Hey, it's fun. How many of you guys have ever heard of bisexual erasure as a concept? Yeah, okay, that's a lot more than I expected. So for those of you who haven't, bisexual erasure is this idea that through social pressures, both implicit and explicit, bisexual people are impelled to be either heterosexual or homosexual, one way or another. I'm going to be looking at Jane Eyre. So logically, being a Victorian novel, they're probably not impelled to, wave around the rainbow flag. They're impelled to be, right, they're impelled to be straight. And that's still a big problem that I think myself and a lot of other bisexual people face in the modern world is people trying to tell us to be straight. So, do I use this correctly? There we go. So this is the main book that I used to write this essay. It's called Queer Social Philosophy, and it's by Randall Halley. So there's this idea amongst queer philosophers of compulsory heterosexuality. The idea that in societies, especially modern Abrahamic religion-based societies, I will get there in 1 second, we are compelled to be straight people. That makes sense of heteronormativity. That is called, brought to you by 90s Microsoft Word art, the heterocoital imperative. Other than an unnecessarily large word made up by some white guy, this is this is a hugely important idea because it centers around the bipolarization of gender. So Halley argues that that heteronormativity in our society comes about not just through signaling of don't be gay or religious signaling or anything like that. It comes about specifically through the separation of the genders. And through that way, we see them as yin and yang. We see them as positive and negative sides of a magnet. What do yin and yang and positive sides of a magnet do? They come together. Dichotomies have to align in order for there to be fulfillment. You need opposite halves. And he says that through the binaries, we ultimately create this institution in which queer people feel as if they must become part of this duality in order to be truly fulfilled. How does this result in Jane Eyre? By Charlotte Bronte, who was actually potentially bisexual. If you look up Ellen Nussey, you might be surprised, but that's an aside. Hey, the GIF worked. I didn't think it would GIF. Okay, so this is a GIF of Jane Eyre and her childhood friend Helen Burns. So we'll get to the GIF in a second, but I want to first talk about Helen Burns' name, because Charlotte Bronte uses a lot of really interesting names in her books. Burns is an obvious allusion to fire. So throughout the entire novel, fire is used in association with passion. It's used in association especially with sexual passion. Now, these kids are pretty young, so I prefer to look at it as perhaps a little more romantic, but there's undeniable, I don't like to fetishize, so there's undeniable homo-romanticism between these two characters. As Helen lays dying in this scene, Jane climbs into bed with her and kisses her. That's pretty gay. But in all seriousness, it is intensely homo-romantic. That's my English teacher. She's very proud. But in all seriousness, it is an intensely homo-romantic experience and homoerotic experience. And this is the only truly homo-romantic experience of Jane's entire life. And I see that as representative of the fact that she is young and she has not yet been completely socialized, especially because she goes to a boarding school entirely made up of women. She has not been exposed to the other half of this gender dichotomy very much. Interestingly, though, she never refers to Helen as more than a friend, and we can already see the power of the heterocoital imperative taking place, because we know that she has read Genesis. The opening line, or not the opening line, but the opening law of Genesis says that you must be fruitful and multiply. You must come together and through coitus, penile vaginal penetration, which is an important part of the heterocoital imperative, have children. It even later says a man will leave his wife and will leave his mother and cling to his woman. There is this intense image within Genesis of people, of male and female, coming together because they need to. Jane is already getting used to this idea, and through this bipolarization of the genders, even at such a young age, she is unable to view her intense romantic feelings for Helen Burns as anything more than purely platonic. Now we get to this guy, Rochester. Someone else talked about him. You know Rochester. He's the not nice guy of the story. Now, Rochester, if you can see from this image, is an intensely masculine guy. He is first associated with this big black dog named Pilot and this huge black horse. He's chiseled, he's athletic. Once again, he's associated with fire imagery. He's associated with everything that the ideal virile man should be. And in that way, he fulfills one of the major parts of the heterocoital imperative, being that he represents the precise opposite of the gender binary to Jane's demure femininity. And through that dichotomy, Jane ends up experiencing intense sexual attraction to him. Even though he is ugly, she ends up actually seeing him as beautiful. It's actually an important part of the book that he is an ugly person, but by the end, because of that intense masculinity and the binary between them, she is able to see him as beautiful, even though he isn't and is actually harboring another wife up in his room, which actually is kind of tangential to my whole argument. Then there's this woman whose name is Diana Rivers. So Diana Rivers has another name that I want to talk about, because Diana, if you guys know, is the Roman goddess of the hunt. The Roman goddess of the hunt hangs out with a bunch of other virgin women hunting. That's a thing that straight people do. Hang out with your gal pals, having a good day. But once again, as soon as I read that name, I was like, this is pretty gay, let's see what happens with it. And I noticed that there is a really intense romantic attachment between these two characters. The one that, in my opinion, is only matched by her attachment to Helen Burns. The romantic attachment, the emotional connection that she feels with Diana, is not paralleled by what she feels with Rochester. With Diana, there are images of her leaning her head on her knee. She uses the word intimacy to describe their relationship, which I don't believe she uses with any other men in the entire book. But once again, it's friendship. It's, they are cousins. It's kinship at best. And through, once again, this constant socialization and the association of male and female as the dichotomy, we end up getting another time when her own, where the other half of her sexuality, the homosexual half, is kind of repressed, and instead she thinks we're purely friends. Now, the last relationship I want to talk about is this guy, whose name is St. John, or St. John, as I call him, because that's how his name is written. Now, St. John is an intensely religious man, and he wants to marry Jane by the end of the novel after making her the head of a schoolhouse that preaches religious ideology. Now, once again, I want to bring back this idea of the Abrahamic religion and those who teach it, because, as I said before, it enhances the gender binary and the bipolarization of the genders, right? By the way, I'm only talking about the binary genders because, that's what we're focusing on right now. But with St. John's character, St. John's character, we see that he wants to marry her. And he says that if they were to go off and go to Africa, where they're planning to go, do the white man's burden thing of bring Christianity to all the non-Christian people of the world, she would need to be his wife. He says that there is no other way that she could accompany him. He says that he implies this, he doesn't say it explicitly, but he basically implies that a woman's use is incomplete without coitus. Jane says in a piece of her narration, she says, he would scrupulously observe the rules of marriage, the duties of marriage, meaning sex. He would have to have her procreating in order for her to be useful. Once again, this goes back to the signaling of the society of male and female, and that for women to ultimately feel fulfilled and to feel necessitated, they must engage in coitus, in the act of heterosexual sex, I guess. And St. John is really the final nail in the coffin, at which point she completely abandons her homosexuality half of her bisexuality, and she returns to Mr. Rochester, that virile masculine person. But here's my problem with Jane Eyre. No one sees Jane Eyre as a queer novel, or at least very few people do. Really only queer people like myself do. Because the idea of the heterocoital imperative still exists. Compulsory heterosexuality, heteronormativity is still a huge issue. And people don't look past it because it's easier not to. And to be honest, it doesn't make sense that someone would put homoerotic subtext within a Victorian novel. It wasn't okay back then. But it's there, and it's within most people. There's evidence that everyone has bisexual tendencies. But through this bipolarization of the genders, you ultimately get a society in which people like Jane Eyre are forced to shun aside one half of their attraction and move to a purely monosexual attraction. Thank you.
Okay, we have a little time. A few questions? Okay.
This question is specifically for Sophia. So I haven't read Giovanni's Room, but I saw I'm Not Your Negro, and know a little bit about James Baldwin. So there seem to be a lot of parallels between David in the book, like him going to Paris to escape exile, and James Baldwin. And the only real main difference I can just gather from your presentation is that James Baldwin is black and David is white. So I'm wondering why you think that, if you had to suppose, why James Baldwin chose a character who was Caucasian and also mirrored so many other aspects of himself, but just not his race.
That's a really good question. So obviously this is how I interpret it. I think that by making David white, if he were to make him queer and black, when this novel came out, the publishers wouldn't take it, and they're like, "This is for your sake. This is controversial. It's going to be really controversial. This is super gay, and it's not something we're going to be able to sell whatsoever, and it's going to ruin your reputation." And so I think that by taking blackness out of it, he was trying not to talk about blackness in this novel, which is interesting, because I think he was focusing on queerness and universalizing that experience for everybody. And I think, unfortunately, when you take, I don't personally, I don't like that this is the case, but when you take race out of things, it makes it easier for a lot of white people to feel like it's universal and something that they can identify with, which is, again, super frustrating because if it's a person, you should be able to identify with them, in my opinion. But I think that he wasn't trying to talk about blackness in this piece of writing. And especially seeing as it's interesting how David has so much privilege, like he's just teeming with privilege, but he's also one of the whiniest people you'll meet. And he's kind of painfully at times unaware of this, how much privilege he has. And there's also this expectation, because he is a white man, to be a lot of things that otherwise I don't think they're expectations that are even like afforded societally to black men. And so I think that there's a lot of different reasons, but incorporating that whiteness into there adds a layer of privilege that if it were a black man in the story, just would not be able to have. Obviously, I can't speak for James Baldwin, but that's how I interpreted it.
Okay. I know someone saw another hand.
Hi, this is for everyone. You guys all talked about the ways in which you kind of saw yourself in storylines, narratives, specific characters. I just wanted to ask, like, what you find to be so important about literature in particular in terms of relatability, and if there are any other places, either specific books or just art in general, that you feel is sort of an important area for people to explore who are either feel like an other, feel like they're questioning themselves. It's a broad question, but.
Okay, I can go first, I guess. I mean, I got lucky. I was, is this work? Can you guys hear me without it? It's fine. I have a loud voice. Keep it. Okay. Okay. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Now it's working. So, so I got lucky in that my coming out story was pretty unintense. I grew up in the type of household where if you used gay as an insult, like my parents would yell at you. Like I come from a very liberal place, and that was never a worry. But I do know that that even after coming out, I have struggled with the idea of being bi a lot because, as I say, there's this idea that we are compelled to be one or the other, hetero or homosexual. And oftentimes it has felt like that my own attraction to the same gender is not enough to warrant the title queer. But after having seen in some media or in stories that my friends have written, the representation of bisexual people who are unsure of their identity in the same way, especially in that, do I technically count as bi even if I'm lopsided? It has really helped me kind of feel secure in my own identity, because seeing people we can relate to and seeing people who are us is ultimately how we recognize that this isn't abnormal and you still deserve a certain, label that you might feel comfortable with.
Kind of like, I think specifically for me, like when I was younger and kind of still, I wonder, or I think like, why am I like here? Like, what is my place? Like, what am I meant to do? And so like reading books when I was younger and like, or just hearing stories and like kind of looking around, like I saw like women frequently always get married, and kind of like, I remember when I was younger, actually, like it's a very vivid memory. When we were younger, I remember we went around the room at like an icebreaker. It was like an icebreaker game. I forgot the event. And they were like, what do you want to do when you grow up? And one girl said, get married. And I remember I always remembered that. And I was like, really? Like, like there's a lot more in life to like, you can become successful, get like a high ranking job. Like there's so much more you can do. And so like, I mean, not to criticize marriage. Marriage is great. Like you can, like having a companion is always helpful, because being alone is sometimes kind of hard. And so like, when I read Pride and Prejudice, and also when I watch TV shows like Master of None, and I think I speak for a lot of people that like, like when they are relatable and when you kind of see yourself and you kind of like reaffirm, like, and it kind of helps me specifically with these books, like it helped me find a sense of purpose. Like you can be who you want to be, and you can like do what you want, and it's okay. And I guess that's kind of like the thing now. Like, we're a lot more open. People are a lot more open. You can do what you want, and you don't have to, as everybody on the panel and like here is kind of saying, like, you don't have to stick to like very strict social codes, and society's becoming more open. And so I kind of appreciate that about like literature and like specifically like film, I guess, with Netflix. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think something that was difficult for me was like, so there's a lot of YA or young adult literature about queer people now, but there isn't, like, that's not really considered, unfortunately, classic or serious, like books with literary merit. It's not taken very seriously, so it is difficult to be a student and be reading things in class that do not reflect a lot of your experience with your sexuality, and often with gender as well. When you read things consistently by white men, like, it gets pretty exhausting because they're all, I don't know, I'm just like, all right, I got it. But I do think that what's, like, for me, I've had to kind of seek those things out on my own, and I think I love Giovanni's Room and I love Call Me By Your Name, but those are also written by men. And there is something about being a queer female identifying person that is especially difficult to find literature that's taken seriously. Some I really like are Orlando by Virginia Woolf, because she was definitely not heterosexual. And Ruby Fruit Jungle, which is like pretty trash. But it's like quintessential. It's like it's not great writing, but it's like was a pretty big landmark in queer literature. So I do think that it's difficult because a lot of it exists, but it's not the kind of work that's being taken seriously where it should. It's the same thing with women writers. A lot of literary work is called chick lit, or there's different terms, and it kind of demeans as if like women's struggles and problems are not somehow worth thinking about and studying and analyzing. So it's definitely really frustrating from that standpoint. So I think that having more, queerness in literature is not just going to be advantageous to queer students. I think it's going to be advantageous to everybody, because even if you don't identify with the LGBTQ spectrum at all, whatever, like, that doesn't matter. It also reflects just feeling queer in any sense of the word as well, I think. I think feeling different and feeling like you stray from the binary or the norm, wherever it be, is really important to have reflected in our literature, because otherwise it gives this idea that America belongs to one kind of person only, whereas I do not think that's the case. I think it belongs to everybody. And so, yeah, I think it's just like we need to have that reflected in our school curriculum, because as much as I can go seek that out by myself, I would like for my school to be forcing that kind of stuff. I want that to be required reading for people who don't really seek books out on their own time.
All right, let's give them a hand. We are actually, thank you. That was an excellent panel. We are going to forego the break and go directly to the next panel. So if we can do a switch so that we can make sure we get completed in time.